Hey everyone, and welcome to CS121, lecture number 11. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about constructors and a new concept called overloading. So if you remember how we introduced classes before, we use this analogy to kind of describe them as being like blueprints or templates. So look at this blueprint for a house. It might tell us some specifications, like that all houses should have windows and all houses should have a front door. Basically, what a blueprint tells us is the specifications that we need to know in order to build or construct a house. But by itself, a blueprint doesn't really do very much for us. Like, we need to use the blueprints so that we can create something real, like to construct a real house. And in CS, we use classes like blueprints to construct objects or instances of that class. And that process of creating objects is called instantiating objects. And the way that we do that is through special functions called constructors. So constructors, they're special member functions, and one thing that makes them special is that they're always the same name as the class. So say we have a whale class here, and we have a constructor for whale objects or whale instances, which we know is a constructor because the function is also named whale, right? The class is named whale, and this function is also called whale. And if you see here, it has no parameters specified in the parentheses. A constructor that doesn't accept any parameters is called a default constructor. And in this case, there's nothing within the curly braces. Sometimes default constructors don't do anything, like here, and their definitions are left empty. Other times, the default constructor might initialize some default values to its member variables, like here setting the age underscore member variable in the whale class to 0. So how do we use constructors to construct real objects in our code? The syntax depends on what constructor you're invoking. So if you want to call the default constructor, the format in C++ is to first specify the class name and then the variable name and then a semicolon. And since it doesn't take in any parameters, you don't need to specify parentheses or any arguments to pass into the constructor. So here's some examples. So if we want to invoke the default constructor for the whale class, you can specify the name of the class whale and then give some variable name for your instance. So you could name it my whale or blue whale, and then you just follow it by a semicolon. And that, each of these lines invokes the default constructor. Another special thing about the default constructor in particular is the C++ compiler provides an empty default constructor for you if you don't define any constructors yourself. So in this class, you can see in the public section, I only have this one setter, set age, and I didn't define any function that's the same name as the class. So there's no constructor here that I defined explicitly. So if I were to write, say, this line of code right here to invoke the default constructor, right? I have the name of the class whale, and then I have a variable name, and then just a semicolon. So this is going to try to invoke the default constructor. So this line of code will compile because the default constructor is implicitly defined for us by the compiler. So we're invoking the default constructor, which wasn't explicitly written out here in the class, but because we don't have any other constructors defined ourselves in the class, this will be provided for us. The whale default constructor will be provided for us, and the default constructor that's provided by C++ doesn't really do anything. It's not going to set the age to any default value. It's just going to allow us to create this instance. So take a look at the whale class now. If I were to invoke the default constructor like I did before, do you think it would compile now? So take a moment to pause if you need to and make a guess. In this case, this would be a compiler error. And the reason for this is because we've defined a constructor already in the class. We have a non-default constructor here. It takes in a parameter, so it's not a default constructor. It takes in an integer age. So this non-default constructor is defined by us, and we already wrote it out in this class, which means that C++ isn't going to provide a default constructor for us. So the compiler error that you would see if you try to invoke the default constructor like we did here is that it would indicate that there's no matching function call. Basically, there's no constructor that accepts no arguments, and trying to invoke a constructor that takes in no arguments is like calling a function that doesn't exist, right? The compiler will be like, you're trying to invoke this function, but there is no matching function for this call.